Stone cutting. The ancient world of Greece was revolutionary in its architecture and monument making. The buildings were often made of wood, clay, limestone, but it was most commonly marble. Marble was a preferred substance because it was sturdy. Marble was cut using water or with natural cleaves as strong points. Along the fissures, iron was wedged, and iron mallets were used to eventually cut and push the block up. Sanding was often used once the block was cut and brought up to make the block all pretty and fit the dimensions of the building that the stone needed to be.
Measurement and weights. Measurement units came from parts of the body like the finger or foot. The cubit was almost a unit standard. Lengths were measured by sconion, a cord of standard length, hallucis, a metallic chain more expensive than the cord option, or kalamos, a measuring rod from reed or wood. Triangles were the basis of measurement. Much of the pre-calculus like items of sine, cosine, and tan nature were developed at this time. The dioptra was a serving tool using triangles, and the odometer could be used to indicate travel by a vehicle. Levels were used to make sure things were leveled.
Cement and concrete. The Greeks used limestone that was heated with sand added to make a mortar-like mixture. Tabby, which is in essence a very strong form of concrete, is made using limestone and other elements. Modern tabby-based structures may be seen in current-day Savannah, Georgia. Structures here use ash, sand, limestone, and crushed oyster shells to make a near impenetrable fortress of stone. The mortar here is very hard and very difficult to break through. Concrete and cement are mixed to make molds, and these molds are then used to make concrete structures in the ancient world. These mortars are paramount in constructing the structures of the Greco-Roman world. Many buildings simply would not exist without this development.
Ancient Greeks had bathtubs with underground plumbing, and the bathtubs themselves were made out of lead. And although the tubs were no more than 30 inches high, it was considered quite advanced for the time because they could essentially have a hot bath or a cold bath, although usually men had cold baths because using hot water was considered feminine and Greek men were very macho, were not going to be manly. There was also clay pipes to deliver the water system into the homes of the Greeks, and there were also flush toilets and sewers, which were considered highly innovative ideas for that time. Sewers, of course, help prevent disease, especially in metropolitan areas, and it also had flush toilets and pressurized sewers, which was an incredible innovation for that time. By contrast, the Romans did have kind of an indoor plumbing system, but indoor plumbing really wouldn't become a thing until the late 19th century. For example, Williams Hall was actually quite important in the history of Emory University, as it was one of the first buildings in this area to have running water, which was considered a huge innovation for its time.
Greek temples. Temples were for statues of gods to be housed, and temples were the most ornate and widespread buildings in the Greek Empire. Sacrifices were often made here, and unlike today, the temples were not social centers. They were places to sacrifice to the gods and pray to them. The stone and columns of these temples would become some of the most engineered items of the Greek Empire. Temples contained a cult statue of deity. Nails.
Domes were found in baths, villas, palaces, and tombs. Oculi, a hole at the top of a dome, were common. The Pantheon is the most commonly referenced dome, and the domes were often segmented and had oculi. Now, the word dome itself is interesting. The English word dome ultimately derives from the Latin word domus, which means house. Now, this might not sound extraordinary, but this originally comes from the word house of God, regardless of the shape of its roof. And this is reflected in its use. Domio, which is usually a term used for cathedral in several languages, and it's especially applicable in Greek culture. A dome is typically found in a religious building, and the way that's constructed is the bricks are built in a circle until a single hole is left, which is, of course, the oculi. Now, this is interesting. The hole is actually supported by the weight of the bricks around it, and this is how a dome is constructed, layer by layer. It's not all put on at once, but it is carefully constructed.
There were three kinds of columns in ancient Greece: the Dorian columns, which were kind of the least level of fancy, Ionic columns, which were a middle level of fancy, and Corinthian columns, which were the most fancy. These columns were incredibly important in Greco-Roman architecture, seeing as how columns were oftentimes used in temples, which of course housed the cult statues of the gods, which was incredibly important to ancient Greece. And in fact, a lot of Greco-Roman architecture of this form can be seen today. For example, the JRC has I find it interesting, there's Dorian columns on the bottom, Ionic columns on the middle, and Corinthian columns on top. So if you ever forget the order they're in, you can just think of the JRC, and Corinthian columns are on top, and they're on the top of the totem pole. And also, Greco-Roman architecture can be seen in many facets of daily life today, such as fraternity houses oftentimes have Ionic columns outside of them. Corinthian columns can be seen in a variety of highbrow places, and Dorian columns are often at times used in Greco-Roman inspired home architecture today. There is also the terms Dorian, Ionic, and Corinthian are also used in terms of the scale factor. When playing instruments, oftentimes Dorian is the first, and then Ionic second, Corinthian third.